welcome to Views with Joyce Waddell. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're talking with Dr. Floki, and we're talking about the new book that he has written, and I heard him discuss this book on radio. He had such an interesting discussion on things that he had researched and things that he had written. So I invited him to share some of his thoughts, some of the things in his book, with this viewing audience. He's done wide research. He's presented his book in many, many other audiences, large and small, throughout this nation. And so we're fortunate that he's sharing it with us today. As usual, he says that I have my own points of view, but I try to be very objective, and usually I take the point of view of an author, a particular author that I'm reading. And even though this book may be an old book, he says, 1903, it's called The Souls of Black Folk. And this is by Vwjw. And this was even before people were called black, that he was using that term for people of color. So evidently he had a lot of wisdom, and he had a lot of courage, as well as he believed in education. So usually when I'm discussing something, it's usually not my own philosophy. It's usually those of something that someone else has written on the subject whom I admire. Welcome, Dr. Floki.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Now, Dr. Floki, your book is The Crisis and Challenge of Black Miseducation in America. Now, someone else wrote something called Miseducation of the Negro.
That's correct. In fact, the classic work of this was done in 1933 by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who founded Black History Week and later became Black History Month. So you might say that my book is really an extension of the work of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, extension up into the year 2002.
You know, when I saw the word miseducation, challenge of miseducation in America, the word miseducation, that led me right back to him. And then I bought your book, of course, but you didn't use very many quotes from him.
Are you talking about Du Bois, or you talking about Carter?
Carter
Woodson,
Miseducation of the Negro. That's what he taught.
Oh yes, I did. I used quite a few quotes in there about Dr. Carter G. Woodson. One of the things that he said, in fact, I think I included this in my introduction. In essence, he said that the present education system in America, again, he said this in 1933, does not work very well for the white man. And therefore, obviously, you know, it does not work very well for the black man. So therefore, to the extent that black people are capable, we should develop systems, alternative systems of our own. He said that back in 1933, and here we are in the year 2003, and we still have not gotten the message that we ought to be doing what Dr. Carter G. Woodson advised us to do back in 1933. Shame on us.
Okay, you say shame on us. Now you're blaming the victim.
Shame on us for not listening to Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Frederick Douglass, and many other of our wise ancestors. If we had listened to them many years ago, we would have been much farther ahead in our struggle than we are now.
Now, why is that not blaming the victim if you're saying shame on us and we didn't do what we were supposed to do?
Well, I don't have any problem with blaming the victim per se. I blame the victim for what the victim needs to be blamed for. But I don't blame the victim for other crimes that other people have inflicted upon us. If you're going to put all the blame on the victim or even all the blame on the oppressor, you're wrong. It's not either or, it's both. And my position is that the primary responsibility for the damage, whether it's miseducation, whether it's wealth, whatever has happened to us, the primary blame should go to the dominant majority community because they have the power, they have the resources, and they initiated racism. Black people didn't initiate racism. It was initiated by the majority community. So I put the primary blame on the dominant majority. That doesn't mean that we are blameless. We must share our fair share of the blame for those things we have not done, and even for some things that we have done. So it's not either or, it's both, and it's in relative terms. Relatively speaking, we are blameless in terms of the larger majority, but we certainly have our fair share of the blame. And not only that, we have a major responsibility because the majority community, which has oppressed and suppressed us, will not correct the problem. We are the ones who must take the initiative and try to solve the problem.
That's what I would say all along, and I would not think anything different.
Well, we're together on that.
Okay, back to the miseducation, your book, The Crisis and Challenge of Miseducation in America.
Black miseducation in America.
Okay.
Yes.
Black miseducation, but you
Yes.
just said whites were miseducated too, didn't you?
I agree, but the book is oriented toward black people because, again, we have to take the primary responsibility for correcting the problem. So my book is really oriented toward black people. So I'm dealing with black miseducation. And the subtitle is very important also. The subtitle is Confronting the Destruction of African People Through Eurocentric Public Schools. I'm focusing on the public schools, and basically I'm saying the public schools are destroying African people, and therefore we have a challenge to do something about that. Last week I went down to a conference in Fort Valley State University in Georgia.
Before you say that, have you gone to the schools to see exactly what the curriculum was?
Oh, yes. And I have even textbooks. I've looked at the textbooks.
Have you been inside of the classrooms?
Oh, yes, I have.
To see, and are you basically talking about North Carolina and not the entire nation?
No, I'm talking about most of the nation. I have worked and examined public school system in Youngstown, Ohio. I've examined the public school system in great detail in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I've examined the Charlotte-Mecklenburg system in great detail, and I've also examined other systems. So I'm not talking about just Charlotte, North Carolina.
If given a position, paid position, to help rectify some of the things that you see and that you've quoted in your book, would you take that paid position and do so and offer your services so that you can really make a difference in what you believe in?
Only as a consultant. I'm not interested in employment at this point in my life. I'm retired and enjoying my retirement, enjoying researching, enjoying writing, enjoying speaking, and I neither want nor need a job. So I'm very fortunate in that respect. So I will take a position only as a temporary consultant. I do not want a job that over an extended period of time. My 8 to 5 days are over, and praise God.
Well, many people, had it not been for the education that you received, you were in the military, an officer in the military, you finished high school and finished college and went on. Had it not been for your education, which was similar to what's happening now, could you have been independently wealthy like you are now?
Well, I'm not independently wealthy. I'll correct you on that one. But I received, during my formal education, I received miseducation.
But it did help you.
Oh, yes, it helped me. Yes, it helped some. But most of my education has come as a result of my own personal initiative. And incidentally, that's also true with Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Carter G. Woodson said, in essence, although he had a PhD degree, I think from Harvard University, he said it took him 30 years just to overcome the miseducation that he received in the school system. 30 years. So Dr. Carter G. Woodson also was engaged in self-education, which is the only genuine, authentic education for black people in America, because with minor exceptions, we do not get educated in the public school system, whether you're talking about secondary system or you're talking about higher education, universities and colleges, whatever it may be. There is no genuine education for black people in America, with minor exceptions where you have some independent schools and maybe 1 or 2 charter schools that are trying to do something. But by and large, most of the systems of education in America are miseducating black people. And that has been going on for a very long time, starting in the days of slavery, 250 years of no education. And then for another 100 years, separate but unequal miseducation. We, African Americans, have never been genuinely educated through the public school system.
Artists, we'll continue to talk with Dr. Faloki as we talk about his new book. The one that he has just written is right off the press, and the title of that book is The Crisis and Challenge of Black Miseducation in America. And so that's what we're talking about. We're discussing the things that he has written, the things that he has researched. And those things are really important as we talk about miseducation and we talk about educating people and the things that we as a group of people can do to become educated and to educate ourselves. So you believe in self-education. If you believe in self-education, do you go back to the days of slavery when blacks had to self-educate? Because as we think about the rise of the high schools in North Carolina, they came about in like 1925, 24 was the time that they were, before that it was private schools anyway. So basically.
Well, there was some self-education in the time of slavery, but bear in mind that it was a crime to even be caught reading and writing if you were black for 250 years in slavery. So there was very little so-called self-educating going on. There were a few blacks who managed to get some kind of education, either through their slave masters or on their own initiative. People like Frederick Douglass, for example, who became very articulate spokesman for the anti-slavery causes. So there were a handful of blacks who managed to receive some level of education during the period of slavery. But very few blacks, mostly blacks were illiterate during slavery. And even during the era after slavery, racial segregation, the school system was so grossly inadequate. It was called separate but equal, but it was separate and grossly unequal. I came up under that system, and therefore I can tell you with great authority how bad that system was in many respects. And that is why many blacks fought to desegregate the schools. And we did succeed to some extent in desegregating the schools, but we went from the frying pan into the fire. We got into a system, a racist system, Eurocentric system, I will call it, where our students were not genuinely educated. The curriculum, for an example, was essentially a European-oriented curriculum. We were taught and still believe, many blacks still believe, that nothing good came out of Africa, that Africa was what I call the Tarzan image, a land of barbarism. They don't understand, even to this very day, that we were the first great civilizations in the world, giving the world everything that we call civilization, from math to science to architecture, the first university, you name it. That history has been hidden from us, and we are miseducated to believe that everything good and civilized came out of Europe, starting with ancient Greece. And that's why we have, even today in the black community, all these organizations which call themselves Greek letter organizations, which is an oxymoron as far as I'm concerned. Greek letter organization. Black Greeks, that's a contradiction in terms. They have been miseducated, pure and simple, miseducated about their own heritage and culture.
When you say blacks, what do you say there rather than our, as if you're not one of us?
No, I'm not one of those black Greeks. No, indeed. I want no part of them whatsoever, other than to try to educate them about their own, about their African heritage and culture. No part whatsoever.
Okay, back to the miseducation. Education can come in many different forms, in many different avenues, many different paths.
Correct.
And it seeks to, with its major purpose, to enlighten the individual, to make him more a product of a society that he can function in and become self-sufficient in. So how can he be miseducated?
Well, that's a European concept of education. Self-sufficiency is a European concept. It's based upon European selfishness, greed, narrow-mindedness. That's not the African concept of education. The African concept of education is one of holistic development. You develop your spirit, your mind, and your body so that you can become godlike, not me firstism. You become a part of your community, what we call a person in community. So it's a totally different concept of education in Africa than it is in Europe.
What is European concept? Is it economic development, self-sufficiency, becoming a better person, a better product, performing greater in your society, making a contribution to yourself and to mankind?
Well, I think you did a good job of describing it. It's based upon selfishness and greed and individualism. That's exactly what it's based upon, and that's why Dr. Carter G. Woodson said it's not a good system. It's based upon a flawed philosophical foundation. It is not a good system. It's based upon me first, what they call self-actualization, and not self-transcendence, that you give of yourself to a larger self, to the society where you become communal, where you're concerned about everybody, not just me first. And that's why we have so many problems in America today, because both blacks and whites have become individualistic in their orientation as opposed to communal in their orientation. And that's why we're having problems, you and I, in the Black Caucus, because you have all these individual egos that are there getting in the way of communal issues and concerns. There is no community agenda in the Black Caucus. They have only narrow-minded individual agendas. That's the problem.
Back to the miseducation of black people. I'm going back here as I look in the souls of black folks, going back to Booker T. Washington, who was one of the forerunners of educating black people, and he had a particular agenda, which is different.
Yeah. No, he didn't believe in educating black people. He believed in training black people
them
to make them servants for white people. In blunt terms, he was an Uncle Tom. That's what
That's
Du
what
Bois called him. That's what Carter G. Woodson called him. That's what he was, pure and simple.
So listen, what Booker T, he had some strengths in his philosophy, because he went to Tuskegee Institute, and he was there at Tuskegee Institute helping people, basically black men, with vocational training, so that they could take skills and not have to depend on anybody and become self-sufficient economically.
Well, first thing, let me talk about self-sufficiency. That's a myth. I don't know, that's a European word and a myth. There is no such thing as self-sufficiency. We are all interdependent. We depend upon each other. You have on a dress. Did you make it yourself?
Yes.
Okay, good. Where did the cloth come from? Did you manufacture the cloth?
Yes.
Oh, where did it come from? We are all interdependent. No one is completely self-sufficient. That's a myth. And not only that, the American corporations are not self-sufficient. Every time they get in trouble, who do they go to? The U.S. government. U.S. Air, all the airlines now are in deep trouble. Where are they going? Why don't they be self-sufficient? Chrysler, Lockheed, there's a long series of corporations in America who are continually getting in trouble, and they go to the U.S. government for handouts. Why aren't they self-sufficient? So we need to get out of this trap, this self-sufficiency trap. They only ask black people to be self-sufficient, and we've been robbed for 400 years, and there's no way we can be self-sufficient. We need to get paid for what we've done, reparations.
We're coming back to the miseducation in America and how we have miseducation and what we can do about it, as you mentioned in your book. So there are certain things, if people are miseducated, then there must be some way when that can be corrected. And from your research, that's what this audience needs to know. And we're going to pause for a moment. So we'll take a short break. Do not go away, and we'll come right back.
With diabetes, you feel more vulnerable.
Every day is a new challenge.
Diabetes has made me improve my life. I take better care now.
I could actually die from the flu.
Being in control is the only way to survive.
A flu shot? Guess you could say it's like a life preserver when you have diabetes.
I'm going to ask my doctor for a flu shot today.
Artists, we're continuing to talk with Dr. Faloki as he talks about his new book, The Miseducation of Black Americans, the crisis and challenge of black miseducation in America. And we're looking at some instances in history as we compare some things about earlier writers and earlier people of African American descent who sought to educate Americans. And basically I'm focusing back as I read from The Souls of Black Folk, and as I read some of the things of Booker T. Washington. This book was written by Du Bois, but he talked about Booker T. Washington and some of the things that Washington wanted to do back then. And not only that, George Washington Carver did some of the same things to help people where they were so that they could earn a living and they could be trained so that they can earn their own money as a way of educating them. And that's why I titled the program Creative Education, because there are many, many things that we can do, but the ultimate goal of education is universal and it's very specific.
Well, you're right in many respects, and I admire some of the things that Booker T. Washington did. I admire most of the things, if not all of the things, that Dr. George Washington Carver did. And I don't like to compare the two because they were in a sort of a different mode.
And they were very different.
Mode altogether.
But they all were centered around Tuskegee.
Well, yeah, the truth of the matter is, though, what Booker T. Washington did in many respects, he was providing a trained, not educated, a trained workforce for white America to work at menial, lower level positions. He was not that interested in self-sufficiency, although self-sufficiency, to use your terms, which I reject outright, was not really the goal per se, but it was obviously to help a vast number of black people to become economically more viable in this society. And to that extent that he did that, that's good. I applaud that. But bottom line, Booker T. Washington opposed the things that would give us greater dignity. Genuine education, he opposed civil rights measures, voting, and all those other things that we would give us dignity as a people. He opposed that, and that's why people like Dr. W.B. Du Bois
start fighting him, and that's
exactly right.
And they start fighting among themselves because
Well,
if you
that's
listen
correct.
to this, in answer to this, Mr. Washington distinctly asked the black people to give up, at least for present. He didn't say forever. For present, 3 things. First, political power, because it was bogging them down. They couldn't do anything. Second, insistence on civil rights. Third, higher education of Negro youth, and concentrate all their energies on industrial education, the accumulation of wealth in the South. So he gave them, he didn't say give it up forever. Concentrate on accumulation of wealth. And that was the avenue that he saw wealth as coming.
Well, of course,
At the time, at that particular time.
yeah. Well, of course, you know, that was his particular philosophy, and he's entitled to his particular philosophy. I don't think you.
But
give up.
he led a group of people, and they listened. He led the masses, and they listened. So evidently, there was some substance in it, or they wouldn't have followed him. People don't tend to follow the same thing over and over and over if it's wrong.
He didn't lead the masses, so that's a misstatement
I'm reading
of fact.
this.
Well, go ahead.
I didn't make it up.
Go ahead, read it. Read it. Read me. Show me where Booker T. Washington led the masses.
The largest group of Negroes began to follow his philosophy. In fact, the masses of Negroes did because they were striving to be somebody.
Well, let me just say this to you. The largest mass organization of black people during that era was initiated by the Honorable Marcus Garvey. He had over 2 million people in his organization who followed him, and he promoted a totally different idea. He promoted, not totally different, but in part, he promoted the idea of black nationalism, pride in yourself as to who you are, your dignity, and that's a quite contrast with what Booker T. Washington advocated. So I don't think you can give up temporarily your civil rights, your political rights, or anything else. You fight for all of them. You fight for your
At the same time.
Yes, you fight for all of them at the same time. You don't surrender. The truth of the matter is, Booker T. Washington was appointed by white people following an address that he made in 1895 at what you call the Atlanta Exposition. He was appointed by white people, and basically he told blacks and whites, and I'll quote him direct, cast down your buckets where you are. In other words, accept your status in society, black folks. You're on the bottom, so accept being on the bottom and prepare yourself to work for white people at the level that they will accept you. That's what he advocated, and that's what Dr. Du Bois rejected. That's what I reject. That is what I call Uncle Tomism.
Okay, back to the crisis and challenge of miseducation in America. So you've been in several of the schools, and you've looked at the curriculum.
Yes.
And that's what you based a lot of this on, because you don't like what you see happening.
Well, the curriculum is only one thing. There's a long series of things that are happening in the school system that I do not like. In fact, I'll go so far as to say the present European-oriented system is dysfunctional in terms of black people. So the curriculum, I would start with the curriculum first and foremost and begin to teach black people about their heritage and their culture. Here we have in Charlotte, 43% of the students are African American in the public school system. And almost nothing is taught about our heritage and culture. Can you imagine?
Are you sure?
I've looked at it. And not only that, the teachers can't teach it because the teachers don't know. There is no professional education. Even as I sit here and talk to you, there is no professional education on African American history and culture now.
That's
in the public school system of Charlotte-Mecklenburg. And I have gone before the school board and I've made this point. And not only that, I've challenged the school board. I said, if you think your teachers know African American history and culture so that they can teach it to the students, if you think you know African American history and culture, I have a test in my book. It's a test on African American history and culture.
Is it in this book?
It's in that book. 60 questions. And I use a short titled Chitlin test. The Chitlin test. I said, if you think you know it so you can teach our students, you take the test. And I would bet you almost 100% of the school board members, the administrators, and the teachers would flunk it. How can you teach what you do not know?
Is your test standardized?
What do you mean by that? Is it accepted by certain white people in the state legislature? What do you mean by that? It's according to my standards. It's according to my standards. That's the only standard I need, based upon my research, my reading, and my teaching at 6 universities. That's the only standard I need. I don't need white people to embrace, endorse, or anything else on my tests.
Is there validity?
I didn't embrace and endorse theirs that they give to our students and flunk them out and make them drop out of school and go into prisons. So why should they? I look for them to endorse and standardize mine.
Now, is there validity in it?
What do you mean, is there validity in it? It's valid in terms that it deals with our history and culture as opposed to European history and culture.
Artists, we'll continue to talk with Dr. Filokis. He talks about his new book, The Crisis and Challenge of Black Miseducation in America, confronting the destruction of African American people through Eurocentric public schools. Are all schools Eurocentric?
Not all schools, but most of the public schools in this country are Eurocentric. Most of them are. And there have been a number of educators, including myself, who've attempted to change that Eurocentric orientation. A major effort was made in New York, major effort was made in Atlanta, major effort was made in Portland, Oregon, all over the country. We have tried to change the system. It has been very, very difficult to get any kind of African American heritage and culture in this Eurocentric system. I think the reason is very obvious, because when you begin to teach African American history and culture, you also have to teach, honestly, for the first time, European history, Euro-American history and culture. And it's an ugly history that people don't want to face.
Audience, we'll continue to talk with Dr. Filokis. We talk about his new book, The Crisis and Challenge of Black Miseducation in America. And we're going to ask him to come back and share maybe some other things from his book as we compare it to some of the other things that I'm reading in history about education, about educating blacks. I've been an educator for 30 years and wrote curriculum, designed curriculum, and monitored it. So thank you for being with us. And tune in again next week for another interesting program. Okay, we're going.